Warm welcome to all of you to this latest Theory from the Margins Zoom webinar for this term, where we have a very distinguished guest, one of the foremost post-colonial and African scholars, Professor Mahmood Mamdani. Now, in this Zoom webinar, we'll be discussing his latest monograph, Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities, which was published by Harvard University Press last year in November 2020, and in many respects is a crowning achievement, so to speak, of an extremely long and distinguished career in academia, both in the US, in South Africa, and in his native Uganda. It is my honor as a member of the Theory from the Margins to introduce Professor Mamdani before we proceed to his introduction of Neither Settler Nor Native. Now, my 11-year-old daughter told me earlier today that she didn't know who Professor Mamdani was because he was apparently not on TikTok or on Instagram. But for those of us who have been following African letters and African scholarship over the years, I myself am Sindre Bangstad. I'm a research professor at KIFO in Oslo, Norway, with a background as a social anthropologist working in Cape Town, South Africa, among other places. Mamdani is certainly one of the towering figures that we've all, whose scholarship we've all related to in one way or another. So by way of a short introduction, Mamdani was born 1946 in Kampala, in Mumbai, I believe, but you grew up in Kampala, Uganda, and you're the director of the Makerere Institute of Social Research in Kampala, Uganda, and the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government at the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia University, and a Professor of Anthropology, Political Science, and African Studies at the same university. From 1999 to 2004, Mamdani was the director of the Institute of African Studies at Columbia University. From 1996 to 1999, he was director of the Center for African Studies at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Mamdani studied at the University of Pittsburgh and did his PhD at Harvard University. Among the many things you probably do not know about Professor Mamdani is that he took an active part in the civil rights struggle in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 and was imprisoned for taking part in civil rights marches in Birmingham, Alabama, that he was expelled from his native Uganda by Idi Amin in 1972 and spent some time as a refugee in the UK, that his Ugandan citizenship was revoked by orders of President Milton Obote due to Professor Mamdani's criticism of the Ugandan government policies, rendering him, in effect, stateless in 1984. Mamdani has held professorships at the University of Dar es Salaam, Makerere University, and visiting professorships at the University of Durban Westville in South Africa, the Nero Memorial Museum and Library in Delhi, India, and at Princeton University. He is the recipient of the Herskovits Prize from the African Students Association and the Leavitt Award from Columbia University. He holds honorary degrees from the University of Johannesburg, Addis Ababa, and the University of KwaZulu-Natal. The author of more than 12 individual monographs, Mamdani is known for books such as Politics and Class Formation in Uganda, 1976, Academic Freedom in Africa, 1994, Citizen and Subject, Contemporary Africa and the Legacy of Late Colonialism, 1996, When Victims Become Killers, Colonialism, Nativism and Genocide in Rwanda, 2001, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, America, the Cold War and the Roots of Terror, 2004, Saviors and Survivors, Darfur Politics and the War on Terror, 2009, and lately, Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities from 2020. Mamdani is married to the distinguished filmmaker Mira Nair and is the father of Zohran Kwame Mamdani, a hip-hop artist and socialist member of the New York State Assembly, representing Queens, New York. So, Professor Mamdani, we are extremely honored and privileged to have you grace Theory from the Margins with your presence and are very much looking forward to engaging with you about this latest monograph of yours. So over to you, Professor Mamdani.
Thank you very much, Indre. I thought it was beginning to sound like a funeral oration, but that's to refer to the generosity of the introduction. I thank the organizers for inviting me, and I thank all those who are on this Zoom and on the Facebook. Neither Settler Nor Native is a book about the nation state and about post-colonial modernity. The introduction opens with a history of the two phases in the history of the nation state, non-liberal and liberal. The nation state was born in Iberia in 1492. Its agenda was summed up by a single slogan: one country, one people, one religion. This state project set fire to relations between majority and minorities within its boundaries, setting in motion processes of ethnic cleansing, specifically of Jews and Muslims. This was followed by a century of religious wars in Europe. This was the first, the non-liberal phase in the making of the nation state. The 1648 Treaty of Westphalia was the antidote to religious wars. Two key components of the modern state were born at Westphalia: religious toleration at home and the reciprocal guarantee of sovereignty abroad. The liberal justification was put forward in John Locke's treatise on tolerance. Catholics can be tolerated if they renounce political support of the Pope or of any power outside England. The liberal notion of the nation state turned majority and minority, in Locke's case, Protestants and Catholics, into permanent political identities. Only the majority has sovereignty. The minority must not participate in sovereignty. The notion of a sovereign majority alongside non-sovereign minorities was the original liberal sin. In this book, I explore the export of the notion of different kinds of citizens, sovereign and non-sovereign, from the US to South Africa and Nazi Germany, and finally to Israel. At the same time, the book explores the construction of an epistemological project that grounded the political distinction between sovereign and non-sovereign subjects in an epistemic and legal distinction. What began as a political distinction between religious groups was extended to a civilizational one between races and tribes. This development is explored in some detail in the chapter on Sudan. This is also a book about the United States as a founding experience in modern colonialism, and about the reservation as the site where core institutions of modern colonialism were forged. In addition, this is a book about extreme violence as a consequence of modern nation-state building in the post-colonies. I contrast two ways of thinking of extreme violence. The first is the criminal model popularized by Nuremberg. The second is the political model born of the transition from apartheid in South Africa. What can we learn from the failure of denazification in Germany and from the relative success of the post-apartheid transition in South Africa? Finally, the book asks, what is transportable in the South African experience? What does South Africa have to teach us? To answer this question, the last chapter takes a fresh look through South African lenses at Israel-Palestine, the most intractable political problem in today's world. In the time at my disposal, I'd like to comment on 4 issues. The first is an issue of great significance in the US today. How do we distinguish colonialism from racial domination? Second, what is the difference between an immigrant and a settler? This is an issue of relevance to all settler colonies, in particular, the US, South Africa, and Israel. Third, what does it mean to think of identity as historical and political, born of a particular form of the state, as opposed to something natural and permanent? Finally, I point to the need to think of an alternative to the nation state so as to decouple the nation and the state. Let me begin with the US, American Indians, and African Americans. What's in a name? How should we name the pre-Columbian communities of the Americas? As Indian or as Native? What difference would it make if we renamed the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. as the National Museum of the Native American? Why is it that the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not apply to Indians and reservations, but did to African Americans and other minorities, so that a separate Indian Civil Rights Act had to be passed in 1968? The two acts are not the same. The 1964 Act is constitutionally binding, whereas the 1968 Indian Act is only advisory. Reservation Indians are not and have never been rights-bearing citizens of the US in a constitutional sense. The reservation was a creation of the US. The reservation is a separate polity, separate from the US. The Europeans who came to America were not immigrants, they were settlers. Whether they seek equality or advantage, immigrants come to join existing polities. Settlers come to displace existing polities and establish their own exclusive sovereignty. Indian reservations are not part of the sovereign state we call the US. In the words of Chief Justice John Marshall, writing in mid-19th century, reservations are domestic dependent colonies. Politically, the term Indian tribal sovereignty masks colonial domination. Reservation Indians are legally wards of Congress. Reservation authorities are overseen by a vast federal bureaucracy known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It is no different from the colonial bureaucracy that governed any indirect rule colony in Africa. The Indian reservation was part of a two-state solution, a sovereign state alongside a non-sovereign protectorate. The two-state solution was Lincoln's contribution in the second half of the 19th century. Lincoln claimed to provide a permanent solution for Indians who had survived the genocide. America also originated the notion of differentiated citizenship, with only some participating in sovereignty. Until 1921, Indians were nationals but not citizens. After that, Indians had to be naturalized as citizens, meaning they had first to be purged as members of Indian polities before they could become US citizens. Africans were enslaved individually and then governed in thousands of plantations. Indians were colonized as a people. Colonized Indians and African slaves represent two different strategies of domination with radically different consequences. Reservation Indians and African Americans do not have the same relationship to the US. Racial and colonial domination are not the same, even if racial discrimination is common to both. Economically, the American Indian symbolized stolen land. The African slave embodied stolen labor. Politically, Indians were governed in a protectorate as part of a two-state solution. African slaves were racially segregated within a one-state polity and governed in separate plantations. Invented in America, the two-state solution was exported to Germany. Whereas Hitler wanted to extinguish all minorities in Germany, post-Holocaust Germany looked for a two-state solution. Instead of reintegrating Jews into Germany, it supported a state exclusively for Jews. The Israelis pushed for their own two-state solution, starting with the Nakba. The Nakba continues today. It is worth noting that South Africa is the place where apartheid tried but failed to press home a two-state solution. The one-state solution has provided a more suitable framework for the development of the struggle against Jim Crow and racial domination. A multi-state solution, as in the Indian case, fragmented and isolated the colonized in reservations, which South Africans call Bantustans. Even if it proceeded by fits and starts, sometimes even receded, the one-state framework has made possible the development of alliances. The two-state solution explains the continued isolation and colonial subjugation of the reservation Indian. I come to South Africa. South African settlers attained state independence in 1910. Over the next few years, settlers studied how Indians were governed in North America. Three key elements of the American model were imported to South Africa: homeland, traditional authority, and customary law. First, every tribe must be territorially contained in a homeland. Second, every homeland must be administered by a homeland authority, sanctioned as trans-historical and traditional, and thus not subject to being elected. Finally, this traditional authority must enforce a customary law on the homeland, also claimed to be trans-historical and thus unchanging, with one proviso that custom be excised of all practices or notions that settlers considered repugnant to civilization. South Africa was not the only one to learn from the US. So did Germany and Hitler. Hitler learned that genocide is doable and therefore thinkable, and that it's possible to legislate a hierarchy of citizens, some first class, others second class, and yet others third class, as with Puerto Ricans, African Americans, and Indian citizens after 1921. Hitler appointed a committee of lawyers to study American citizenship laws as preparation to draft Nuremberg laws for Jews. This learning process has been documented in some detail by James Q. Whitman of Yale University in his book, Hitler's American Model. Denazification failed because Nuremberg shut its eyes to the political project that inspired and propelled Nazism. That project was the nation state. Nazism went beyond distinguishing a sovereign majority from non-sovereign minorities. It strove for a purified nation state, one that would cleanse the nation of all minorities. There was an American debate on Nazism after the Second World War. Was Germany liberated or occupied? Was Nazism a state project or a social project? Who should be held responsible for Nazism? The nation or the state? Nazi leaders or the German people? The American consensus was that responsibility for Nazism lay with the German people. At Nuremberg and after, millions were considered criminally culpable, yet Nazism was never probed as a political project. A similar debate unfolded in Germany, particularly among German left intellectuals, the most prominent being Franz Neumann and Herbert Marcuse. Their answer: Nazism was a nation-state project, a project of both the Nazi state and the folk nation to eradicate the state territory of all national minorities like Jews, Roma, and others. Nazism was above all a political project. Their conclusion was that to succeed, Denazification would have to be a joint project of allies and anti-fascist Germans. But Americans were unwilling to do so. The Soviets were, though only temporarily, and not after the Berlin Uprising. I come to Israel and the US. Are Jewish people in Israel settlers or immigrants? The Jewish population of Mandate Palestine belonged to three groups: natives, immigrants, and settlers, the last being the group that wanted to establish an exclusive state. Palestinians inside Israel cannot participate in sovereignty. They have rights, even political rights, including the right to vote, but they cannot participate in power. Israel is officially a Jewish state. There is in Israel-Palestine an ongoing debate on the merits of a one-state versus a two-state solution. It calls on us to think through the difference between colonial and racial subjugation, even where racism plagues both. In American terms, it is the alternative represented by the African slave and the colonized Indian. For a third alternative, we have to look at the South African transition from apartheid. I trace the turning point in anti-apartheid politics in South Africa to the 1970s. Anti-apartheid politics before 1970s reproduced the racialized architecture of apartheid. Each racial group organized separately as defined by apartheid power. Africans as African National Congress, Indians as Natal Indian Congress, coloreds as Colored People's Congress, and whites as Congress of Democrats. By reproducing the architecture of apartheid inside the resistance, resistance gave apartheid a natural flavor. The apartheid mindset was broken only in the 1970s. The key initiative came from the student movement, starting when Black students led by Biko left the liberal white student organization, formed their own separate body, and went on to organize township dwellers, starting with Soweto. Left in the wilderness, radical white students turned to organizing hostel workers on the fringes of townships. Out of this experience was born an epistemological awakening, that white and Black are political identities, and that political identity is historical, not natural. Black, said Biko, is not a color. If you're oppressed, you're Black. This was also the turning point in the Afrikaner journey, from being junior partners of British colonialism to becoming a part of the anti-apartheid coalition. Born in the 70s and 80s, the South African movement signified three epistemological shifts. From mobilizing opposition to apartheid, it went on to champion an alternative to apartheid. From calling for a state of the majority, the national majority, the Black majority, it went on to champion a state for all. Initially, not just all citizens, but all residents. From an opposition to whites, it went on to oppose white power. It depoliticized race and historicized the notion of majority and minority. 1994 led to the birth of a new political community. This outcome should be seen as an alternative to Nuremberg, which opened the gate to two purified states, a Germany without Jews and an Israel without Palestinians. The Palestinian population is today fragmented into three: colonized citizens of Israel, residents of the occupied territories, and refugees. Since 1948, each has been the source of a different political initiative. Refugees were the social base of the armed struggle. The first Intifada moved the social base of Palestinian resistance from refugees to Israel-Palestine. The second Intifada propelled Balad into calling for an inclusion of Palestinians in the political process, calling for a state of all citizens. After that came BDS. Anchored in the occupied territories, BDS calls for an external boycott, asking the world to divest from Israel. I want to close by summing up South African lessons for Palestine. First, the anti-apartheid struggle was not directed from a single center, but from multiple centers. Sometimes it included contradictory initiatives. Take the example of the anti-apartheid boycott, which was directed from outside the country, and the internal political struggle which demanded reform of the political process to allow them to exercise the right to participate in it. Whereas the anti-apartheid boycott made no distinction between South African state and society, calling for a boycott of both. The internal political struggle succeeded by building alliances with all sectors of white society which oppose the apartheid state, whatever be their reasons. Second, this shift followed a rethinking of the struggle as political, not just moral. Apartheid power was not defeated, neither did apartheid win. The situation in the mid-1980s could only be described as a stalemate. Why then did apartheid agree to negotiate in 1990? Two considerations made captains of apartheid rethink their primary reliance on a military strategy. One, the possibility that anti-apartheid mobilization may spread from townships to Bantustans. But more important was the second possibility that signaled the likelihood of an even more scary outcome. Boers realized that the hitherto pro-apartheid Boer intelligentsia was gradually beginning to abandon apartheid as a state project. In Palestine, this means building on the gains of Balad and adopting a political strategy that will welcome anti-Zionist and non-Zionist Jews into the larger movement for a de-Zionization of the Israeli state. Rather than think of Balad and BDS as representing strategic alternatives, the South African lesson is to embrace both as standing for complementary strategies, external and internal. The lesson of the African-American struggle, too, is to build alliances within a single state so as to forestall the fragmentation, isolation, and continued colonization, as has happened to Indians in North America. Finally, whereas BDS can contribute to Israel's international isolation, something more is needed if a non-Zionist alternative is to bloom in Israel itself. Like in South Africa, that something else will need to be an epistemic revolution that can open the way to a political one. Phase 2 of the Palestinian moment will come when the same dynamic that leads to the unity of the oppressed, excuse me, also leads to the isolation of the oppressors. When it is not just the oppressed who seek political change, but also many of the current supporters of Zionist power. Getting there will require a new kind of political consciousness within Israel. A consciousness based on the recognition that the flourishing of Jews and Jewish life does not require a Zionist state. Excuse me. It is this South African lesson that needs to be driven home to Israelis, as many as possible, that Jews do not need to have a Jewish state to have a secure home in Israel-Palestine. This is also the lesson of Jewish life in New York City. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mamdani. I think your introduction here covers a lot of conceptual ground and provides a very good platform for our further engagement. Let me remind the attendees that we have on Zoom that you're free to pose questions to Professor Mamdani via our chat function. Because after the panelist questions that we're now coming to, we'll have a Q&A with Professor Mamdani based on the questions you submit via chat. Now, For this particular Zoom webinar, we have the following members of Theory from the Margins. There is Associate Professor Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, who's our chief technician today. He's at the University of Oslo in Norway. We have Kristin Soraya Batman-Jelici, an associate professor at the University of Oslo, but joining us, I believe, from Detroit. And we have Srilata Sirka of King's College in London, joining us from Cardiff after a bit of a hectic train journey earlier today. And last but not least, we have Associate Professor Jonas Debesay from Oslo Metropolitan University in Oslo, Norway. And we'll provide the platform for you to pose the first question, Jonas. But you might want to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your own work, ever so briefly. Over to you, Jonas.
Yes, thank you, Sindre, for the introduction. My name is Jonas Debesay. I work at the Faculty of Health Sciences at the Oslo Metropolitan University. My research areas is within professional work, healthcare, and migration in general, and have been working at the university for almost 15 years. So that's briefly about me. I come originally from Eritrea, and it was interesting to read the part of Sudan and a bit of about Eritrea as well in the book of Professor Mamdani. But over to the question here, and first thank you to the organizers of Theory from the Margins for the opportunity to take part in this interesting seminar to discuss Professor Mahmood Mamdani's new book, Neither Settler Nor Native, the Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities. I have read the book with interest, and I enjoyed reading the book. I learned a lot, and I actually recommend it to everyone to read it if you haven't done so yet. Although I do not have the in-depth knowledge of the historical creation and development of the various countries that you, Professor Mamdani, mention in your book, it has been interesting to follow your comparisons and arguments across different nations, social structures. So my question to you revolves around what seems to me, at least, as a focal point in your book, which is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So my question to you is, in your chapter 1 of the book, you have given an extensive account of the nation-state building of English settlers in America, and thereby the exclusion of natives during this colonization from the 17th century and onward. In what ways is the United States handling or treatment of Native Americans during the occupation of indigenous land important to understand the question of Holocaust and Nuremberg, and ultimately the state of Israel's treatment of Palestinians today? I'm probably asking you to explain your whole book in just a few minutes, but if you could just briefly give us an idea of these specific connections with the United States. Thank you.
You're not the first one to ask me to explain the whole book as a response to one question, but what's different between different questioners is the question they ask. And the vantage point from which they come. Hitler drew two lessons from the US. The first was that genocide is doable and therefore thinkable. Hitler was full of admiration of how America exterminated the red race in its move to the West. The second lesson that Hitler drew from America was that it is possible to create a second and a third class citizenship, as with African Americans, the Indians who survived after 1921, Puerto Ricans in the US later on. Hitler appointed a committee of lawyers to study African American citizenship laws. This background preparation led to the drafting of Nuremberg laws. The learning process, as I said earlier, has been documented in some detail by James Q. Whitman in his book, Hitler's American Model. Now, the US handling of Indians was in two phases: physical elimination, phase one, and containment of the surviving Indians in concentration camps called reservations. Reservations were not a part of the US. They formed a separate political community. They were part of a two-state solution, wherein one state was sovereign, which was the US, and the other, the reservation, or each of the reservations, was a non-sovereign protectorate. As I have explained, Germany adopted a two-state strategy after Nuremberg, giving as much support as possible for Jews who had survived the Holocaust to move to a Jewish homeland in Israel instead of returning to Germany. So that, ironically, post-Hitler Germany politically, in a way, followed Hitler's own vision of a Germany and a Europe without Jews. Israel adopted a two-state strategy, and it took this strategy from the US, which is a settler state, and alongside a settler state, a series of protectorates, Indian reservations. That's the most sense I can make from Israeli strategy in whether it's Gaza, whether it's the West Bank, the occupied territories, whether it's the refugees outside the boundaries of contemporary Israel. Thank you.
So the next question comes from Associate Professor Christine Soraya Batman-Jelici. The floor is yours, Soraya.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Professor Mamdani. Thank you for being here. It reminds me of way back when I would listen to you and Mamadou Diop speak at Columbia way back when. So thank you for being here. I have a two-part question, and it's not going to be short and sweet. It's going to be incredibly direct because I read the section on America quite closely, and I'm hoping you don't mind its sort of directness. So it's a two-part question. In the States, as you know, we've been hearing more conversations, louder calls for reparations, on college campuses, government offices, churches, online talk radio, so on and so forth. And just 2 months ago, at the Jesuit Conference of Priests, they pledged to raise over $100 million to benefit descendants of enslaved people that it once owned, and more so to start promoting racial reconciliation initiatives. This is around the same time that I think Virginia Theological Seminary, they started giving out cash payments to descendants of Black Americans that they forced to work there. So in your work, you speak about the responsibility of the state to champion these efforts and not charitable individuals. You contend that it's the state that sanctions wrongs necessitating restitution. And I truly would like to push back on that statement, especially for the American context. I'd argue that it was both the state and the church that worked hand in hand to exclude, to enslave, to suppress, to do violence on Black and Brown communities. So why not hold them both accountable for settler colonialism? Why not ask the Catholic Church and other powerful religious institutions to also think seriously about their historical criminal role in colonizing the political? And there's another part, a caveat, also a part about messaging and what would likely be the most successful, or who would likely be the most successful delivering this message of reparations in the United States. You and I, when you come back to the States, You and I live in a country that is so skeptical of this kind of initiative, reparations, I mean, from big governments. The fact of the matter is that many need-based programs operating long-term in inner cities and rural areas across America are funded by charitable foundations and private individuals. You know that churches, they run food banks, shelters, AA programs, after-school programs, and so on and so forth. And many Americans trust these religious institutions over the state, so they're more likely to accept a message of sea change with regard to reparations from the religious institutions than from the US government. So when the Catholic Church finally begins to take a stand in reparations, don't you take this as necessary, timely, and a step in the right direction for the American context? If you could please respond to this, I would be so grateful.
Thank you very much. Great question. And it gives me an opportunity to say something which is not really in the book. Although you can take some clues from the chapter on South Africa. I draw a distinction between perpetrators and beneficiaries. I argue that human rights theory has been focusing almost exclusively on perpetrators. I also argue that if you want to understand how extreme violence is reproduced cycle after cycle, in the case of slavery, over centuries, it's not enough to look at perpetrators. More than perpetrators, it's crucial to look at beneficiaries. Now, you've made an argument for who were the perpetrators, the state and the church. They worked hand in hand, you say, to enslave Africans. Fine. I don't think sins of perpetrators are visited on their children. We don't try children for crimes committed by their parents. Children do not inherit the intentionality of their parents. But what children do inherit are the benefits their parents derived from the crimes they committed. I believe that children can be held responsible if we talk of reparations. But I think the appropriate constituency to pay reparations are not perpetrators. They are beneficiaries. So who are the beneficiaries in the case of slavery? The beneficiaries, I would argue, the entire non-slave settler society, whether they participated in the slave trade or not, they were beneficiaries of the slave trade. After all, you can't think of the industrialization of America, even of Europe, without the slave trade. I'm surprised you didn't ask me why the reparations should be limited to the US. If society was a beneficiary, the state claims to be a representative of society. America is a democracy where the government is elected by the people. That responsibility belongs to the state. As you note, Americans hate to pay taxes. Americans don't trust the state. Americans love to think of themselves as charitable philanthropists. They love to feel good. Rich Americans will spend millions of dollars to not pay a tax and will pay millions to charities. Reparations is not a charity. Reparations is a debt. It's payback time. And that payback has to come from the representative American society, which is the state. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
So I turn now to my own question, Professor Mamdani, and that has to do with South Africa again. And given my background as an anthropologist, I did my first ethnographic fieldwork on Muslims in post-apartheid Cape Town, South Africa, working in townships and informal settlements in Cape Town in the early 2000s. Now, in chapter 3 of Neither Settler Nor Natives, entitled Settlers and Natives in Apartheid South Africa, you return to South Africa and some of the themes covered in your seminal monograph, Citizen and Subject, Contemporary Africa and the Legacy of Late Colonialism, which was published by Princeton University Press back in 1996. And in the context of the negotiated transition from apartheid to democracy, you remain as trenchantly critical of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC, as I remember you from those days as a young and aspiring anthropologist. And you basically regard it as an expression of a neoliberal logic, the conflation of criminal and political violence, and the individualization of responsibility for the horrors of a racist political system on the model of the Nuremberg process, basically. In contradistinction, your view of the Codesa negotiations, which laid the grounds for the post-apartheid political order and the 1996 constitution, is very positive. You basically hold up to what you refer to as the South African moment as a model to emulate for anyone wanting to decolonize the political in today's world and contend that it exemplifies a survivor's justice by which the enemy has been redefined as not settlers, but the settler state, not whites, but white power, and argue that the South African experience proves that political identities are, quote unquote, historical, not essential to those identified. Now, however, as you yourself readily admit, for all its achievements, the South African moment has, of course, so far failed to deliver anything resembling social justice for the main victims of apartheid's racial and social economic engineering, namely Black South Africans. And I'm referring here to Black South Africans in the sense that Stephen Bantu Biko famously referred to them. In other words, those oppressed by the apartheid system. And that oppression, of course, included not only those who self-identified as blacks, it would also include quite a number of colored South Africans and Indian South Africans. So my question then is, critics may wonder whether this doesn't somehow prevent ordinary South Africans from seeing themselves as survivors rather than victims, and that it poses a challenge to the overall argument you make herein. So I basically wanted you to respond to that kind of criticism.
Okay, thank you. So I'll take this in two parts. First is the TRC, perpetrators. And the second is the beneficiaries, the absence of social justice, the fact that the beneficiaries got off scot-free, more or less. So let me begin with the TRC. As I argue in the book, the TRC saw itself as some kind of a latter-day Nuremberg, with one difference. Instead of crime and punishment, which was the guiding motto of Nuremberg, the TRC turned to crime and forgiveness. But like Nuremberg, it saw apartheid as a collection of crimes by hundreds of thousands or hundreds of thousands of individuals. Same as Nuremberg did. The violence of apartheid from the TRC's point of view, oh no, sorry, first let me say it my point of view. The violence of apartheid, like that of Nuremberg, was enabled first and foremost by the state. You can't imagine the Holocaust, and you cannot imagine apartheid without the centrality of the state. Now, this is where we have a problem with the language of crime as used by both Nuremberg and by TRC. The language of crime is inappropriate because crime is committed against the state. By definition, the state cannot commit crime. Nuremberg had nothing to say about the crime committed by the Nazi state, about the political project of the Nazi state. And the TRC had nothing to say about the political project of the apartheid state. What it had to say was about agents of the state, individual agents who had exceeded their orders. And they must be held responsible for this excess. But apartheid was not an excess. Apartheid was the orders. So that's the first part of your question. The second part of your question is enfranchising all survivors, not just victims, durable in the absence of social justice. I mean, without social justice, you say, how can victims become survivors? And I agree with you. I don't disagree at all. I agree that we have an unfinished project in South Africa. But my point of view is that the struggle for social justice needs more than a compelling argument. It needs more than an intellectual argument. It needs social forces which are able to make that argument compelling on the ground. And I say that there's a better chance for it in a post-1994 South Africa, which has been politically reformed. You can see this in the mobilizations like roads must fall, fees must fall. These are multiracial mobilizations. They're not mobilizations which pit black against white. And they testify to how the ground has shifted because of the political reform that has deracialized citizenship. But you can also see it by negative example in what is called xenophobic violence. Because the South African political reform is not complete. citizenship has been deracialized, but it has not been detribalized. The xenophobic violence in post-1994 South Africa, the target of xenophobic violence is not the racial stranger. It is the tribal stranger. It's not the white person, it's a black person. We have to ask ourselves why. In the absence of a political reform that detribalized citizenship, the struggle for social justice has turned into a tribal war. Gatcha Buthelezi and the Inkatha Freedom Party, who came in control of the Ministry of Internal Affairs in 1994, were determined to disenfranchise non-South African citizens living in South Africa. Because remember, in 1994, when the elections came, the big question was, who can vote? There were two positions. One position was that only citizens can vote. The other position was that anybody, everybody who lives, who is a resident of South Africa can vote. At stake was the right of millions of migrant workers from Lesotho, from Botswana, from Mozambique, from Rhodesia, different places, their right to vote. Those who had lived in South Africa, who even had children born in South Africa, they were not citizens of South Africa, but they had contributed to the social wealth of South Africa. Now, 1994, it was agreed that not only citizens, but also residents, migrants should have the right to vote. That was a phenomenal victory. But from 1994 on, Buthelezi and IFP gradually chipped away at the rights of migrants, waged a political propaganda campaign and then a mobilization in the Black South African community to say that the reason you're poor is because what is rightfully yours is being taken away by these migrants. And social justice requires that you face them, hold them accountable. My point is simply this: without a political reform, the struggle for social justice would have turned into a racial and tribal war. I think there is a better chance for social justice in a politically reformed South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mamdani. I also have to say that when I referred to your critique of the TLC as a trenchant critique, I should have also added that it was at the time and still remains a very refreshing critique. In my own personal encounters with people who had lived through apartheid as the victims in townships and informal settlements, I was also struck with the extent to which your argument resonated with them at the time, because I was arriving in Cape Town in South Africa at the time of the sort of international brouhaha over the TLC, but quickly discovered that a lot of people were quite cynical and skeptical about the TLC, precisely because it didn't address the structural violence and the systemic and more casual forms of racism that they had all lived under. Having said that, I turn now to our last panelist, Associate Professor Srilata Shirka of King's College London. And after her question, we'll proceed to take some of the questions we have received through chat.
Thank you, Sindre, and thank you, Professor Mamdani, for your presentation today. I found your book really thought-provoking, and for the benefit of our audience, I don't directly work on any of the historical contexts that you cover in your book, so I read it very much as, a lay reader. My own work is on South Asia. I'm a geographer of South Asia, and currently my research interest is in trying to construct a historical geography of caste in racial capitalism. And I was surprised to see how easy it was for me to read South Asia into your main propositions in the book. So in the beginning, you talk about the idea of decoupling the nation from the state and the need to think about a post-nation state. And towards the end, you talk about this idea of survivors that Sindre has already brought up, and the need to sort of let go of the categories of settler and native and to think in terms of the category of survivors. And it made me think about the anti-caste philosopher, lawyer, politician Ambedkar in the context of India, who's also the chief architect of the Constitution of India, who in the 1940s, when deliberations were going on about what kind of nation state, what kind of polity, post-colonial India or South Asia is going to be, is famously known to have said that there is a South Africa in every village in India, referring, of course, to caste apartheid or caste society that operates in the mode of apartheid. And based on that, he proposed separate electorates for the caste oppressed Dalit communities, a sort of decolonization within decolonization, which of course did not materialize because of the native elites who you also mentioned towards the beginning, but sort of let off the hook a little bit towards the end. But I will not go very much into that. But the reason that I'm setting out this context is to ask, how do you imagine the relationship between the post-nation state and the project of social justice? And you've just elaborated on that a little bit, in response to Soraya and Sindre, but I'm thinking in a more kind of broader general context outside of the, historical context that you discuss in the book, in terms of, thinking political futures. How do you see the relationship between the post-nation state and social justice? Is one the instrument for the other, or do they necessarily need to coexist and mutually co-construct? If you could just elaborate on that. Thank you.
Big question. Some of it covers the same ground as the previous question, but of course you come at it from a different vantage point, which is Ambedkar in India. I teach in one of the courses I teach at Makerere Institute of Social Research. I have my students read Gandhi's Hind Swaraj and Ambedkar's responses to Gandhi and Iqbal. And we discuss Pune, the Gandhi's fast, and Ambedkar's retreat. Ambedkar, as you say, demanded separate electorates. And Gandhi said he would fast unto death. And Ambedkar withdrew his demand. Now, Ambedkar's demand, it seemed to me, and I think Gandhi was right in thinking this, which is that Ambedkar was following the Muslim route, especially in Bengal. Separate electorates, which had eventually led to a partition of Bengal, and then eventually to a demand for Pakistan. And Gandhi could see, I think he was sort of clairvoyant in seeing that this would be a rerun of what had happened with the British and the Muslims. And Gandhi could see an alliance between the most oppressed in the caste system in India, the untouchables, and the master oppressor, the British. in the conferences that took place. Well, Ambedkar retreated. Pakistan happened. India became independent. And there was a constitutional commission. Ambedkar chaired that commission. And Ambedkar now no longer wanted a separate electorate. He wanted reparations, but not really reparations. He wanted reservations, affirmative action. Personally, I think it's very important to grasp the distinction between reservations or affirmative action and reparations. Reparations have to be to communities, not to individuals within communities, not to individuals in the name of communities. And in my discussion of reparations in the US, I call for reparations for communities, entire communities. What South Africa has had is not reparations. South Africa has had affirmative action, reservations, Black empowerment. Reservations create a middle class elite and then eventually even a richer one, but leave behind the vast majority. Now, I agree with the thrust of your question. I don't agree with the analogy with Ambedkar, and so this is why I begin with this, as I think where I think Ambedkar went wrong. But I agree with the thrust of the question, that social justice has to be primary. Primary does not mean first. I mean, after all, if it had been possible, that would have been a revolution. But we're talking of what in the absence of revolution? Because the pound of flesh the beneficiaries of apartheid extracted from its victims was precisely there would be no social justice. The huge opportunity that TRC missed was to teach white South Africans that they couldn't be let off scot-free, that it was not about a handful of 1,000 or whatever perpetrators. But if you looked at beneficiaries, every white South African was a beneficiary, every white, in terms of where they lived, the taxes they paid, the schools they went to, the cheap labor they employed, whether as domestic servants or in their shops or in their settler farms or wherever. Every South African was a beneficiary. The TRC, by law, its hearings were being broadcast in every home in South Africa. Every evening was an incredible opportunity to carry out public education. The TRC did not. Instead, it created theater, individual perpetrators. Name and shame. So why was there no social justice? My understanding, simply because the balance of social forces was not in favor of social justice. So the political challenge is, how do we create that balance of social forces? And my argument is that in the aftermath of a politically reformed community, the situation is better, more promising for creating that balance of social forces, except that it still lacks another political reform, which is detribalization. You say, aren't these mutually constitutive, political community and social justice? It'd be great. That would be a revolution. But the point is, what if they're not? You know, ironically, in some cases, look at the revolutions. The Russian Revolution, okay, took some steps in the question of social justice, but not in creating a political community which decoupled the state and the nation. The Russians and even the Chinese, 1949, idealized. They took on the liberal presumption that the only natural community is the nation. So the whole question of national self-determination, the self is the nation. Right? Mao's slogan, nations want, I don't know whether nations want, peoples want revolution, nations want independence. There was just no critical thinking about nation. So anyway, I want us to realize that social justice by itself will not get us a different political order. Redistribution can easily happen within a context where the nation and the state are joined together. But I'm also saying we're addressing a different context here, where forces seeking a revolution are not strong and decisive. A revolution meaning social justice, where they had to settle for the second best, which was a reformed political community. And that settlement was worth it because it has brought them to a point, if we are to gauge from roads must fall and fees must fall, then the ground is more fertile. So I'm not saying this is where struggle stops, no. The struggle continues. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Mamdani. Some of you will, of course, know that this is one of the classical anti-apartheid struggle slogans. The struggle continues, la luta continua. We have some few questions from the audience, which Bodhisattva will read out. I apologize in advance for the fact that we're not able to field all the questions due to the time constraints. But over to you, Bodhi.
First of all, thank you, Professor Mamdani, for this. Yeah, so there are quite a few audience questions. So I will start with the first one by Itamar Haritan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, so apologies. So the question is a three-parter. It goes like this. Thank you, Professor Mamdani. I want to ask three questions. One, what is your definition of the political when you say that identity should be depoliticized? Two, how is your call to depoliticize identity different from the liberal call to separate religion and state, or is it? Three, how can Israelis and Palestinians follow the South African path when they don't share a similar notion of belonging to the same territory, that is South Africa?
Okay. Let's begin with the first one. When I speak of identity being depoliticized, let me give an example. A tribe, ethnicity and tribe. Ethnic identity existed long before colonialism. It's been historical. It grows and changes over time. But it's cultural identity. What does it mean to politicize ethnic identity? To politicize it is to ground it territorially. It is to couple, to join cultural identity with territory, with the notion that every ethnic group, every cultural group has a territorial homeland. That, my argument is, begins in the US with the reservations. Cultural identity does not begin in the US. Okay. Tribal identity does. And I'm talking of depoliticizing. I'm saying culture is not territorial. They are diasporic communities. Culture flows over territorial boundaries. The Baganda have their own associations with members in the US, with members in Uganda. The Luos have their own association with members in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Uganda, in Sudan, in the US again, in Britain, etc. So when I'm talking of the political, defining the political, I'm not really talking of a cultural community. I'm talking of a political community. I'm talking of a community whose members have political rights. And my objective is to say that this should have nothing to do with the cultural community. It has everything to do with everybody who is resident within state boundaries. Think of the ANC Freedom Charter, 1955. The Freedom Charter said South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. It didn't say South Africa belongs to all its citizens. No. South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. That decouples nation and state. The liberal call to separate religion and the state, well, I don't know. You would have to explain to me how that is the same as depoliticizing religion. See, liberalism banished religion from the public sphere, right? And it created a secular state. The secular state took the place of the church, especially in the West, because, see, it's only with Western Christianity that the church is not only a community of faith, but also an institutional community represented by an institutional hierarchy. From the Pope at the top down to the floor, whole series of hierarchies. Didn't exist in Islam. It didn't exist anywhere outside Western Christianity, really. It existed to some extent, I think, in Shia Islam, but only not quite. So this notion of religion as a hierarchy of power sort of spread with colonialism. Now, in my view, I mean, I am not particularly in favor of banishing religion from the public sphere. Not really. I am in favor of depoliticizing religion. That's a different issue. The Israelis and the Palestinians do not belong to the same territory. Well, they claim the same territory. Eretz Israel is between the sea and the river. Right? They claim the same territory. The question is, can they coexist on the same territory? I mean, it's very interesting, you know, if you look at contemporary Israeli Jews, the majority of Israeli Jews are what used to be called Arab Jews. Their language was Arabic. Their religion was Judaism. They came to Israel mainly in the 1950s. They were Judaized by the white Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews. Their name was changed from Arab Jews to Mizrahim. They were considered uncivilized. They were considered semi-savages, almost Arab. Culturally, they were treated, some of my Palestinian friends tell me, they were treated worse than Palestinians. They paid back the Ashkenazim by becoming the backbone of religious Zionism. They paid to secular Zionism, the Zionism of the Ashkenazi. But the history of the Mizrahim, the Arab Jews, shows that the claim that Jews and Arabs cannot coexist is bogus. They have coexisted. See, for the Ashkenazim, part of the problem was that the Mizrahim did not share the history of the Holocaust. Anyway, I don't think I agree with the premise of your question. Thank you, Isamar.
So we have maybe time for one more question from the audience. So
so you shouldn't allow a tripartite question. One question is one question.
So this one is from Juan Tri Guin. The question is, again, apologies if I got the name wrong. And it goes, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Could you comment on the problems of the political project of inclusion when it is constituted within the modernist project of nation state? How could inclusion be decolonial? Could the engagement with the struggles of various minorities transform modernity's politics of exclusion? That is also a three-parter. Apologies. Or at least it's three questions.
Look, the nation state is an exclusive project. Okay, it's an exclusive project. It's because it excludes those who don't belong to the nation. And yet, of course, when this led to religious wars in Europe over a century, the advocates of the nation state worked to a reform. They worked to create a liberal political community from a non-liberal one. And so the challenge was inclusion. So the inclusion was of not national minorities on the same terms as the national majority, as the nation. The national minorities still remain non-sovereign. The national majority became sovereign, but it was on the program of rights, individual rights. Every member, every person living within the boundaries of the state will have individual rights. But those who belong to the national minorities will not participate in sovereignty. So this is the nature of liberal inclusion. Its parameters are clearly drawn. It does not remove the distinction between the national majority and the national minority. Thank you, Juan.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Sindre.
So with that, I think we have to wrap up. We've been discussing this book, Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities, with Professor Mahmood Mamdani, live from Kampala, Uganda. We are extremely grateful for you taking the time, Professor Mamdani, to be with us for this Zoom webinar. This is, as I've indicated in my introduction, the very last Zoom webinar this term from Theory from the Margins. We're now taking quite a lengthy break. So would like to thank all of you in the audience and those who have followed us over this roughly 1 year of existence for Theory from the Margins. It's been quite an experience for us in Theory from the Margins to have the opportunity to engage with a truly global audience, and we really appreciate all those taking part and engaging with us. Now, you can follow our events at the theoryfromthemargins.com, our Facebook pages, and we also upload recordings of our Zoom webinars on our YouTube channel. Now, before we part, I'm kind of tempted here because Professor Mamdani is also, if I may say so, quite a stylist when it comes to academic writing. And for us in Theory from the Margins, I think the last passage in Neither Settler Nor Native resonates a great deal because we are made up of global citizens from quite a lot of different parts of the world. And the last passage from chapter 6 of Mamdani's book is entitled Decolonizing the Political Community, page 355, which I'll now read out. The history of political modernity tells those of us who identify with the nation that we have been co-opted. The nation is not inherent in us. It overwhelmed us. Political modernity led us to believe we could not live without the nation state, lest we not only be denied its privileges, but also find ourselves dispossessed in the way of the permanent minority. The nation made the immigrant a settler and the settler a perpetrator. The nation made the local a native and the native a perpetrator too. In this new history, everyone is colonized. Settler, native, perpetrator, and victim, majority and minority. Once we learn this history, we might prefer to be survivors instead. End of quote. And thank you all very much. And a particular thanks to Professor Mamdani and our panel. And as Arnold Schwarzenegger would say, we will be back. Thank you very much.
Professor Bangstad and panelists, thank you very much. I'm not sure I want to honor Arnold Schwarzenegger's pledge, but if I come back, it'll be on other terms. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.